Thanks a lot, Gretchen. A blunt question put straight to the president. Are we losing the war against ISIS? President Obama's response after a second battlefield setback in a week. Also, the showdown over government snooping. Senator Rand Paul spoke for 10 and a half hours to protest the NSA's controversial program. Now its supporters are facing a deadline to take action before that surveillance program could vanish. And a major break in a Washington, D.C. murder mystery. Police say they know who tied up a family, then burned their bodies inside their home. Word is they know the city where he's hiding, too. The big question now, why would a killer go after a couple, a housekeeper and a 10-year-old boy? And the flying mailman whose protest put Capitol Hill on lockdown, learning he could land in prison for that. I'm Harris Faulkner in today for Shepard Smith. President Obama says the United States is not losing to the Islamic State savages, even as we get word the terror army now controls half of all of Syria. That's according to human rights activists who say ISIS has seized yet another strategic city, famous for its ancient ruins and artifacts. The city, Palmyra, along a critical road leading to Syria's capital. Activists say Syrian troops ran for their lives when the fighting got too tough. Their escape kept some civilians from making it out alive. Witnesses are now telling horror stories of a slaughter. Decapitated bodies left to rot in the streets as ISIS moved in. On top of the human suffering, there are concerns the savages of the Islamic State will crush the city's famous ruins, wiping away a footprint of civilization that has stood for 2,000 years. It even made it through World War II. A reminder of just how complicated all this is. The Syrian troops who tried to fight back ISIS are not allies of the United States. They are the fighting force of Syria's President Bashar al-Assad, you know, the one who murders his own people with poisonous gas. The siege of Palmyra comes only days after ISIS took the city of Ramadi in neighboring Iraq. In an interview with The Atlantic magazine, President Obama called it a tactical setback that happened because the U.S. had not trained the Iraqi military protecting Ramadi. We know the Iraqis dropped their weapons and ran when ISIS closed in. I said that. Well, now there's new evidence those troops were simply overwhelmed. ISIS fighters hit the city with 30 car bombs that witnesses say took out entire city blocks. Many of those explosions reportedly with the same force as the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. Now we're told the U.S. is rushing thousands of anti-tank rockets to the Iraqi military to prevent bombings like that from happening again. We have live Team Fox coverage now. Greg Palcott has more on ISIS in Iraq. But first, let's go to John Huddy live in our Middle East news hub. John, there's new concern about what might happen if ISIS keeps control of Palmyra.
Yeah, absolutely, Harris. There are. Palmyra not only has historic relevance, but also now strategic military relevance as well. That's because by taking Palmyra, it puts ISIS in a position to basically advance further west towards the city of Homs and the Homs area. That's about 100 miles to the west of Palmyra. And if you look at the map, Homs is north of Damascus, and it's also very close to the border of Lebanon, only about 10 to 15 miles. Palmyra is also located along a major transportation corridor, so it basically stretches again to the west to Homs and then further southwest down to Damascus. And if you go even further south, you get to the border of Israel. And we've heard about spillover into the Golan Heights here in Israel from the fighting by ISIS fighting Syrian government forces and also other rebels. So now ISIS not only controls large sections of the eastern and northern and northeastern parts of Syria, but now it's advancing further west as well. And also, having said that, Harris, ISIS, by taking over Palmyra, it's the first time ISIS has taken a city from Syria's army.
Yeah. Well, and I'm curious because they had asked us for more help from the skies above with our Air Force, our fighting forces, the coalition air bombers, and still the city fell. The Syrian army right now, is it even putting up a fight at this point?
Well, we've heard reports of Syria's army launching attacks on ISIS positions in and around Palmyra, but really it's having no effect at this point. And along with taking over the city of Palmyra, we also hear that ISIS militants have taken over the city's air base, the city's military intelligence headquarters, and also a prison that was housing hundreds of inmates that were fighting Bashar al-Assad's government and the Syrian government that are now loyal to the terror group. So this is a very, very dangerous situation for Syria and the fight, of course, against ISIS. Harris,
wow,
back to you.
Whole prison full of new recruits. John Huddy reporting live for us. Thank you very much. Now let's go next door to Iraq. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Martin Dempsey, said ISIS savages did not drive Iraqi forces out of Ramadi after all. Instead, Iraqi troops, quote, in his words, drove out on their own. General Dempsey also pointed out he originally predicted it would take 3 years to defeat ISIS. He said that still might be the case. And in the long run, he believes coalition fighters still have the advantage. Greg Palcott with the news live in London now. Greg?
Harris, whatever you want to say about that Ramadi battlefield, there is a consensus. ISIS is ugly. And this week we got some good insights as to where it came from a British Middle East expert by the name of Emma Skye. An expert with a difference. She went to Iraq during the war years as a civilian administrator and quickly became one of the top political advisors to the U.S. military, including Commanding General Ray Odierno. In her new book, The Unraveling, she says nothing that is happening in Iraq right now was inevitable, including the rise of ISIS. She puts a lot of the blame for this latter stage of destabilization on the Obama administration. She says that he was eager to leave Iraq and so doing squandering the gains from the Iraqi surge, in part by propping up the pro-Iran, anti-Sunni, one-time Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. Take a listen to what she says.
It was looking for the easiest option, and the easiest option seemed to be to maintain the status quo.
And that was Maliki?
It was Maliki, but this wasn't stable.
And that led, encouraged by Iran, to Iraq to say no to more U.S. troops after 2011. And that could have led to ISIS. Harris.
Well, Greg, clearly not everybody agrees with her analysis. What's the other side?
And not everyone agrees, although she has good firsthand knowledge. The Obama administration would say something a little bit different. It would say that it tried to keep U.S. troops in Iraq. It will point to a new inclusive Iraqi prime minister, will claim the roots of ISIS go back well before their time in office. But all would agree that the situation now is horrible, and especially for anyone who has served in Iraq. Here is what expert Skye had to say about the young men and women she met in her time in Iraq. Take a listen.
I think they are amazing young people. I think they're the best of America. You see in their values, in how hard they work, in their desire to do good.
Emma Skye, and I think everyone hopes that those who lost their lives in Iraq fighting for the cause will not have died in vain. Back to you.
No doubt. Greg Palcott, thank you very much. Let's bring in Christian Whiten now, former senior advisor at the State Department. He's also author of the book, Smart Power Between Diplomacy and War. And he has an opinion piece. You should read this on foxnews.com right now. Christian, thanks for joining us. You know what? I want to start with the president's statement, which seems negative to me. We are not losing. That's very different than we're winning.
It is, and it's hard. I mean, it would be one thing if he accompanied that with an explanation of strategy, an explanation of what's gone wrong. I mean, losing two major cities, Palmyra in Syria, Ramadi in Iraq, now that ISIS has total control of the Euphrates River Valley leading up to Baghdad. These are bad things. You'd like to see some sort of reticence or explanation, but basically just a vow from the president, echoed by his chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that we're going to keep going with the current strategy.
What about urgency? Do you get a sense of that from the White House and this administration, that they're urgently working to stamp out ISIS?
It almost seems like they're trying to run out the clock until the next administration. I mean, for the chairman to reassert his opinion, which frankly is dubious, that this will be over in 3 years and end favorably. I mean, World War II for the United States took 3.5 years. Does the United States do well with prolonged quagmires where there's no apparent progress, and in fact it looks like there's reverse progress? Not really. We don't do well militarily or politically in those situations, so it's disappointing.
Interesting. Do you think it's a coincidence? He picks the number 3 years, and he said that a few months ago, so that puts us some time into it, but certainly after President Obama's in office.
Yep, it looks just like another way of moving this off the headlines, just like sending 2,000 missiles to Iraq. I mean, part of that is adapting to ISIS's new tactics. They have adapted to our own tactics, which are completely reliant on air power and a dysfunctional Iraqi army. So they've switched more to suicide bombers, to IEDs. This should not come as a surprise to anyone who paid attention to the Iraq war. But sending 2,000 rockets is a way of just checking the box and moving this out of the headlines and saying we're doing something. It's not a real strategy to win.
Well, and I would think that it really speaks to the relationships that we have, too, because the Iraq leadership was asking back in April for us to help them out with anti-tank warfare, and we didn't do it until now, until two major areas fell. And now ISIS has half of one country, Syria, and is moving on, taking as much as it can in Iraq. Speaking of which, those are the facts, by the way. How much? 36,000 square miles of territory inside Syria. You can't erase that. So when you hear General Dempsey of the Pentagon say, you know, they didn't run in Ramadi, they drove away. Are we getting some spin here from this administration? And if so, why?
Yeah, I'm afraid we are. And frankly, for historians, it brings back to mind the dark days, 5 o'clock follies from Saigon, where the military is putting a spin on things. Everyone expects politicians to do that. Joe Biden has given a very upbeat assessment of our progress in Iraq and Syria. But to hear that from military officers is disturbing. As you say, the facts speak for themselves. In fact, they're a little worse. You look at these maps that show thin lines of control of ISIS in Iraq and Syria, but those are where the rivers are, it's where the cities are, it's where the people live. And you can color in all the space in between that. That's basically ISIS territory, too. So we have a very negative situation that our leaders are saying isn't so bad.
Wow, that's really interesting. I hadn't looked at those thin lines of control. I'm looking at the map now. Real quickly before I let you go, I want to bring this back to the United States because there is some criticism about whether we should even be involved in that part of the world militarily. And this new report that the FBI is fanning out teams to high schools across the U.S. They've already started in the state of New Jersey to do this. And they're telling young people to beware the messages from ISIS and other radical Islamists online, to stay away from that propaganda and trying to turn their heads away from that and focus back in on loving America. Your thoughts?
Well, some of the criticism of Obama is a little bit feckless. For Lindsey Graham to say we need 10,000 troops, or neocon Fred Kagan to say we need 15 or 20,000 troops, we need to have a strategy and then have combatant commanders explain to us what resources they need. So they're putting the cart before the horse. As for the domestic threat, I'm glad the FBI is doing something, but it's still a far cry from going after Islamists broadly, going after CAIR, going after the purveyors of the Islamist political ideology. It's a utopian lie, and I think we need to do a better job at that.
Oh, that's interesting. Focusing on our own rather than somebody else. Christian Whiten, always appreciate your perspective, your experience. Thank you very much.